Nobody noticed the hillside was hollow until the day 14-year-old Leo Voss disappeared into it with a shovel and didn't come back out for 6 hours. By the time his father found him, Leo had already dug 11 feet into the slope, his hands blistered raw and a small mountain of displaced dirt piled beside a hole big enough to stand up in. If quiet ingenuity and real, hands-on work means something to you, subscribe and join us every week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. The Voss farm sat in the high valleys of western Montana, ground that produced good hay and hardy cattle but turned genuinely hostile the moment real winter arrived, temperatures dropping well below zero for weeks at a stretch, daylight shrinking to barely 8 hours, and growing season so short that fresh vegetables became, for nearly 5 months of the year, something the family simply did without or paid dearly for at the grocery store 40 minutes away, the produce there half-wilted by the time it made the drive up from wherever it had actually been grown. Leo's father, Hudson Voss, ran 300 acres of cattle and hay with the kind of unhurried, physical competence that came from never having had another option, a man whose hands were permanently cracked and thick-knuckled from 3 decades of winter work, who measured a day's success by what his body had accomplished rather than what he'd planned to accomplish. Leo's mother, Olivia, taught remotely for a community college's agricultural extension program, spending her mornings on video calls in the warm kitchen and her afternoons, more often than not, out in the cold doing whatever physical work the ranch actually demanded that day. Leo had one younger sister, Emma, 10, who mostly kept her distance from the growing pit in the hillside except to occasionally lower down a snack on a rope when Leo forgot to come in for lunch, and one grandmother, Opal, 78. Who lived in the converted loft above the equipment shed and had outlived 2 husbands and 1 hip replacement without losing an ounce of her willingness to sit on a cold porch step just to watch weather move. It was Opal who mentioned it first, almost offhand, one evening in late October, the 2 of them sitting on her porch watching their breath fog in the cooling dusk air. "Ground doesn't freeze the same way air does," she said, not looking at him, just watching the darkening tree lean. "Dig down far enough, insulate it right, and the earth holds close to 50 degrees year-round, no matter what the wind's doing up top." Leo didn't sketch anything. He didn't ask Opal to explain further, didn't look anything up that night, didn't mention it to his parents at dinner. He grabbed a spade the next morning before his father was even up, and started digging into the south-facing slope behind the equipment shed before he'd fully worked out where the walls would actually go, figuring, the way he figured most things, that the ground itself would tell him what it needed as he went, the same way a fence line told you where it wanted to run if you actually walked it instead of just staring at a map. He had nothing but a spade, a mattock for the tougher sections, and a wheelbarrow with a wobbling front wheel his father had been meaning to fix for at least 2 years and never had. The first 2 feet of soil came up easily enough, loose autumn topsoil, dark and workable, the kind of dirt that practically fell away from the spade on its own. Leo made good progress that first morning, enough that he skipped lunch to keep at it, enough that by early afternoon he'd already dug down past his knees. By the 3rd foot, things changed. He hit a dense, tangled mat of old grass roots, decades of undisturbed prairie sod woven together underground into something closer to a natural mesh than soil, turning every shovelful into an actual fight. He had to switch to the mattock, hacking through the root mass in short, hard swings before the spade could bite into anything beneath it, sweat soaking through his shirt despite the cold October air, his forearms burning by mid-afternoon in a way they'd never burn from ordinary chores. His hands blistered by the second afternoon, 2 raw spots on his right palm where the shovel handle rubbed against skin not yet toughened for this kind of sustained work. He kept going anyway, switching his grip periodically to spread the friction around, and by the 4th day the blisters had broken, healed partway, and blistered again in slightly different spots as calluses started forming unevenly beneath the damage. Some days he wrapped his palms in duct tape before he even picked up the shovel, not waiting for the pain to start before addressing it, just accepting it as part of the morning routine the same way he'd accept putting on boots. The dirt itself became its own separate, grinding problem. Every wheelbarrow load had to be hauled up a shallow dirt ramp he'd cut into the pit's north edge with his own 2 feet packing it down trip after trip, then dumped and shaped, not just piled, but arranged deliberately into what would eventually become an insulating berm, a detail Opal had mentioned mattered even before he understood exactly why. By the end of the first week, working essentially every daylight hour he wasn't in school or doing chores. Leo had moved somewhere close to 4 tons of soil, 1 wheelbarrow load at a time, entirely alone, his shoulders and lower back aching by evening in a way that made the farmhouse stairs feel like their own separate obstacle each night, his hand gripping the rail harder than he'd ever needed to before. Emma started keeping a rough tally, chalked on the side of the equipment shed, of how many wheelbarrow loads she'd counted him hauling past, a small, silent form of encouragement neither of them ever discussed directly, the numbers climbing steadily into the 60s, then the 70s, by the time the first week ended. Week 2 brought the clay. Roughly 5 feet down, Leo's spade hit a layer of dense, wet clay that resisted almost entirely, sucking at the blade with every attempt to lift it free, slowing his progress from nearly a foot of depth per afternoon down to barely 3 or 4 inches, exactly the point in the schedule where he could least afford to lose momentum. He kept at it anyway, refusing to simply accept the slower pace, working 2 extra hours after evening chores under a bare shop light bulb strung out on an extension cord from the equipment shed, the cold October night settling in around the small pool of yellow light while he dug, his breath visible, his hands going stiff between shovelfuls. Hudson watched this go on for 4 straight evenings before he finally said anything. "You're going to put your back out digging clay by headlamp in the cold," he told his son, standing at the edge of the pit one evening with his own breath fogging. "Windows closing," Leo said, not stopping. Hudson didn't argue further. He simply drove into town the next morning and came back with a small rented excavator on a trailer, and the two of them spent the following 2 weekend days working the machine through the clay layer together, Hudson running the excavator's bucket at a careful, shallow angle to avoid destabilizing the pit's walls, Leo working below with a hand shovel to clean and square every corner the machine's bucket couldn't reach with any precision. By the end of each of those 2 days, both of them were covered head to boot in thick gray-brown mud, hands raw from gripping tools all day, back sore in the particular way that comes from repeated bending rather than any single strain, saying almost nothing to each other beyond what the actual work required. Hold that, here. Watch the edge, there, 2 people working in a rhythm that didn't need much conversation to function. "Wasn't going to let good groundwork go to waste over stubborn clay," Hudson said, the closest thing to an explanation he offered for showing up at all. With the pit finally excavated to a full 8 feet, Leo moved straight into framing without pausing to draw anything out on paper first, working from the same instinctive, figure-it-out-as-you-go approach that had gotten him this far. He started cutting and setting pressure-treated lumber posts every 4 feet along both long walls, each post sunk into a footing hole he dug entirely by hand with a post-hole digger that blistered a fresh set of calluses across his palms in places the shovel hadn't already toughened, then packed with quick-set concrete he mixed himself in the same cracked wheelbarrow that had hauled 4 tons of dirt 2 weeks earlier, guessing at ratios more than measuring them precisely, correcting the mix by feel when it came out too wet or too dry. The first 3 posts he set weren't quite vertical, soft, recently disturbed dirt shifting slightly under their weight before the concrete had fully cured, throwing each post a few degrees off plumb in a way Leo only caught because he happened to sight down the row and noticed the lean. He didn't leave it. He tore each post back out of the still soft concrete with his bare hands and a length of pipe for leverage, reset them properly using a level and a temporary wooden brace nailed diagonally to hold them straight while the new concrete cured, adding an entire extra day to a schedule that had no extra days built into it, working late into a cold evening by headlamp to make up the lost time. For wall insulation, Leo stacked straw bales against the earthen walls beneath the lumber framing, a technique Opal had mentioned once, almost in passing, remembering her own mother's root cellar. Each bale had to be individually trimmed to fit tight against the irregular, uneven dirt surface behind it, cut down with an ordinary kitchen bread knife that dulled quickly against the tough baling twine and had to be resharpened twice over the course of the work. Loose straw packed into whatever gaps remained after trimming, then each bale pinned firmly in place with long wooden stakes driven straight through it into the earth wall behind, using a heavy mallet that jarred his shoulders with every swing. It took Leo the better part of 4 straight afternoons, working alone in increasingly cold weather, bending, cutting, packing, staking, over and over along the full length of both walls, his fingers going numb around the bread knife's handle by the final afternoon, straw dust working its way into every scratch and cut on his hands until his palms stung constantly whether he was actively working or not. Leo had ordered standard greenhouse polycarbonate panels, cut to size and meant to be installed at a steep pitch he'd worked out using nothing more than a protractor, a tape measure, and a rough sun angle chart Opal happened to have saved from decades earlier in a box of old extension pamphlets. Installing the panels meant working directly on a sloped roof frame sitting a full 8 feet above the open pit below, no safety harness of any kind, just careful, deliberate footing and a single rope Hudson insisted on tying around his son's waist and anchoring to a nearby fence post, a minimal precaution that wouldn't have stopped a serious fall so much as slowed one. Each panel had to be lifted into position entirely by hand, held steady against the roof's steep angle with one arm while the other aligned pre-drilled holes against the frame below, a task that required real upper body strength Leo hadn't fully appreciated needing until his arms started shaking partway through the first panel. Once aligned, each panel needed fastening with rubber gasket screws driven at precisely the right torque, tight enough to seal properly against wind and rain, loose enough not to crack the polycarbonate outright. Leo learned that balance the hard way, cracking 2 full panels on the very first afternoon by over-tightening before his hands finally learned the correct feel for it, the sound of each crack a small, sickening reminder every time he glanced afterward at the 2 ruined panels leaning uselessly against the equipment shed wall. Hudson started showing up for that specific phase of the work every single evening after that, without being asked twice, one of them holding a panel steady from below while the other drove screws from above, working together by headlamp as the days shortened rapidly and the season's first genuinely hard frosts began settling over every unprotected surface on the property. Some evenings they worked past 9 o'clock, Olivia bringing out mugs of coffee that went cold before either of them had a free hand to drink from them, Emma occasionally standing at the pit's edge holding the second headlamp steady when an extra beam of light was needed. The structure was substantially complete by the second week of November, 5 full days ahead of the valley's first true deep freeze, a margin that felt, to Leo, both like a genuine accomplishment and like something achieved by the barest possible thread, despite everything. Despite the weeks of digging and framing in straw and cracked panels, Leo's overnight temperature log, checked with a simple thermometer mounted just above the planting beds, showed the structure's interior dropping to within a few degrees of freezing during the coldest pre-dawn hours, far closer to the danger line than the underlying concept should have allowed. He spent 2 frustrated days troubleshooting before he traced the actual problem. The earthen berm along the structure's north side, the one built from 4 tons of hauled dirt back in week 1, hadn't been given proper time to settle and compact before winter set in, leaving small, invisible air gaps throughout that undermined its entire insulating function, turning what should have been dense thermal mass into something closer to loosely packed dirt with cold air moving freely through it. There was no time left for a careful, patient fix. Leo redid the entire berm over a single frantic weekend, hauling water by bucket from the equipment shed spigot rather than risk a hose bursting in the near-freezing temperatures, soaking and repacking the soil in deliberate layers, tamping each layer down hard with the flat back of a shovel until it held together dense and solid rather than loose, racing the advancing frost line the entire time, working until well past dark both days, his arms visibly shaking with fatigue by the time he set down the last empty bucket Sunday evening. The second temperature test, run 10 days later, held. Nighttime lows inside the structure stayed comfortably above 40 degrees even as the outside temperature dropped towards 0, a gap wide enough that Leo finally allowed himself to believe the whole project had actually worked. By December, he'd planted a modest first crop, spinach, kale, and a handful of hardy root vegetables chosen specifically for their cold tolerance. By January, with the valley outside locked under snow and temperatures regularly dropping below 0, the Voss family was harvesting fresh greens from a hole a 14-year-old boy had dug into his own hillside almost entirely by hand, 4 tons of moved dirt, 2 cracked panels, a full weekend of frantic repair work, blistered palms that had finally, fully healed into permanent calluses, and a rebuilt berm behind every single leaf of it. A neighboring rancher named Guff Halloran drove over that February specifically to see the structure, walking the pit slowly with the particular skepticism of a man who'd farmed that valley for nearly 40 years and had never once considered that the ground itself might solve a problem he'd simply learned to live without solving. His skepticism shifted, over the better part of an hour spent examining the straw-packed walls, the carefully angled glazing, and Leo's meticulously kept temperature logs, into something closer to genuine respect. Never once considered the ground itself might be doing half the work for me, Guff said, standing in the structure's relative warmth while snow fell steadily just above the glazed roofline, if I just built around it right instead of against it. Wendell Berry once wrote that the soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. Leo hadn't set out with any real plan that October morning. He'd set out with a shovel, a single offhand comment from his grandmother, and a stubborn refusal to simply accept 5 more months of nothing green, and he'd worked out every remaining piece of the project with his own 2 hands, one blistered, aching, frustrating day at a time, correcting mistakes as he found them rather than avoiding them through careful planning he'd never much cared for in the first place. Leo is 15 now. He's already talking about a second, larger structure for next fall, though planning, for Leo, still mostly amounts to picking a promising south-facing spot and grabbing a shovel, trusting that the ground itself will tell him the rest as he goes, the same way it always has. Opal still visits the finished pit most days that vegetables are actively growing, settling onto an overturned bucket near the entrance, watching her own breath fog in the cold air just a few feet above ground that, underneath her, stays warm enough all winter long to keep something green alive. What's something you learned only by getting your hands dirty first and figuring out the plan along the way, instead of planning everything out before you started? Tell us in the comments, we read every one. And if stories like this one mean something to you, subscribe. We'd love to have you along.